A defining moment, the Supreme Court addresses. The landscape of police accountability saw a significant development with the United States Supreme Court's ruling in. Delivered on May 15, 2025, this unanimous 9-0 decision has already begun to send ripples through legal and law enforcement circles across the nation. Welcome to Safety First Firearms Training and Consultants with Master Instructor Kenneth Thornton. The case specifically tackled the critical issue of how courts should evaluate the use of force by police officers, a topic that remains at the forefront of public discourse and legal debate. By rebuking a narrower approach previously adopted by some circuit courts, the Supreme Court sought to clarify the standards for assessing these complex and often tragic encounters, aiming for a more comprehensive understanding of the events leading to the use of deadly force. This decision underscores the judiciary's ongoing role in balancing officer safety with the constitutional rights of individuals. The case originated from a fatal incident that occurred on April 28, 2016, just outside Houston, Texas. Constable Roberto Felix Jr. initiated a traffic stop of a vehicle driven by Ashton Barnes. The stated reason for the stop was outstanding toll violations. During this roadside interaction, Constable Felix reported smelling marijuana emanating from Mr. Barnes's vehicle. Following this observation, the officer requested that Mr. Barnes open the trunk of his car. It was at this juncture that the situation began to escalate rapidly, as Mr. Barnes, instead of complying with the request to open the trunk, turned the ignition of his vehicle back on, signaling a potential change in the nature of the encounter from the officer's perspective and setting the stage for the tragic events that followed. In response to Mr. Barnes restarting the engine, Constable Felix took decisive action. He moved to the driver's side, opened the vehicle's door, and unholstered his firearm. Shortly thereafter, Mr. Barnes attempted to drive away from the scene. As the car began to move, Constable Felix made the dangerous decision to jump onto the moving vehicle, clinging to the side door sill. While precariously positioned on the accelerating car, Constable Felix discharged his weapon multiple times into the vehicle. 2 of these shots struck Ashton Barnes, inflicting fatal injuries. The vehicle continued for several hundred feet before coming to a stop, with Mr. Barnes deceased inside, marking a grim end to the traffic stop. Following Mr. Barnes's death, his mother initiated a lawsuit against Constable Felix under 42 U.S.C. Section 1983, which allows individuals to sue government officials for civil rights violations. The lower courts, including the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, had granted qualified immunity to Constable Felix. This decision was largely based on the application of what became known as the moment of threat rule. This rule narrowly focused the legal analysis on the precise instant the officer perceived an immediate threat, potentially disregarding prior actions by both the officer and the suspect that contributed to the critical situation. The Supreme Court's decision to review the case signaled a willingness to scrutinize this controversial standard and its implications for justice. The standard of reasonableness. Understanding totality of the circumstances and imminent threat. The concept of reasonable force is a cornerstone of use of force jurisprudence in the United States. It dictates that law enforcement officers should only use the amount of force necessary to mitigate an incident, make an arrest, or protect themselves or others from harm. However, determining what constitutes reasonable is an inherently complex task, deeply dependent on the specific facts and circumstances of each unique situation. It requires a careful balancing act, weighing the legitimate need for officers to make split-second decisions in high-stress, rapidly evolving scenarios against the fundamental constitutional rights of individuals to be free from excessive force. This balance is often difficult to strike and is subject to intense scrutiny from courts, oversight bodies, and the public. Central to the evaluation of reasonable force is the totality of the circumstances standard, firmly established by the Supreme Court in the landmark 1989 case. This standard mandates that the reasonableness of a particular use of force must be judged from the perspective of a reasonable officer on the scene, rather than with the 20/20 vision of hindsight. Crucially, it requires consideration of all relevant facts and circumstances leading up to the moment force was applied. This includes the severity of the crime at issue, whether the suspect posed an immediate threat to the safety of the officer or others, and whether the suspect was actively resisting arrest or attempting to evade arrest by flight. The decision strongly reaffirmed this holistic approach. The assessment of an imminent threat is a critical component within the totality of the circumstances framework. An imminent threat implies that danger is immediate or so close to happening that an officer must act decisively to prevent harm. The ruling specifically addressed and clarified how this assessment should be conducted. The Supreme Court underscored that determining whether an imminent threat justified the use of force cannot be artificially confined to the single isolated moment the force was deployed. Instead, courts must consider the preceding events and the broader context that shaped the officer's perception of danger. This nuanced understanding acknowledges that threats can develop over time, influenced by a sequence of actions and decisions. In Justice Elena Kagan, writing for the unanimous court, emphasized that the totality of the circumstances standard inherently lacks an artificial time limit. The court explicitly stated that this comprehensive review must include events that occurred earlier in the encounter, which could reasonably have influenced an officer's perception of the situation and their subsequent response. This clarification directly counters the notion that only the events of the final critical seconds matter. By championing this broader temporal scope, the Supreme Court aims to ensure that judicial review of use of force incidents is thorough, contextually sensitive, and reflective of the complex realities officers face, while also holding them accountable for the entirety of their conduct. Shifting legal interpretations, precedents, and the rejection of the moment of threat. The foundation for analyzing police use of force was laid significantly by in 1989. This pivotal Supreme Court decision established the objective reasonableness standard. This standard requires that the appropriateness of an officer's actions be judged based on what a reasonable officer would have done under the same circumstances, without regard to the officer's underlying intent or motivation. Key factors outlined for this assessment include the seriousness of the suspected crime, whether the individual posed an immediate threat to the officer or others, and whether the individual was actively resisting arrest or trying to flee. This framework has guided courts for decades in navigating these challenging cases. Building upon the principles of the Supreme Court's 2014 decision also played a role in shaping the landscape of use of force analysis. The case involved a high-speed vehicle chase, where police ultimately used deadly force, shooting the driver to end the pursuit. In its ruling, the court again emphasized the importance of a context-based analysis, considering the entirety of the chase and the danger posed by the fleeing suspect. Legal analysts have noted that if the Fifth Circuit's narrower moment of threat test, which was at issue had been applied to, the outcome might have been different, potentially absolving officers by focusing only on the final shots fired rather than the preceding chase and its escalations. A crucial aspect of the decision was the Supreme Court's explicit and firm rejection of the moment of threat rule. This narrower standard had been adopted and applied by several federal circuit courts, including the 2nd, 4th, 5th, and 8th circuits. The moment of threat rule improperly constrained judicial review by focusing almost exclusively on the precise instant an officer perceived an immediate danger and decided to use force. This approach often disregarded the officer's own actions or the suspect's preceding behavior that might have contributed to the creation or escalation of that perceived threat, leading to a fragmented and potentially skewed understanding of the incident. The Supreme Court found the moment of threat rule to be fundamentally flawed because it failed to provide a comprehensive or logical framework for assessing the reasonableness of an officer's actions. By isolating a single moment, this rule could inadvertently shield officers from accountability for conduct prior to that moment, even if that conduct unreasonably escalated the situation or violated established police procedures. The court's decision seeks to rectify this by mandating a more holistic review. This ensures that all contributing factors are considered, striving for a more balanced and just evaluation that considers both the officer's perspective and the unfolding sequence of events from beginning to end. This approach aims for greater consistency and fairness in these critical cases. Forging the future implications for law enforcement training, policies, and accountability. The Supreme Court's ruling in carries immediate and significant implications for law enforcement training programs across the United States. The decision unequivocally reinforces the necessity for comprehensive education of officers on the totality of the circumstances standard. Training must go beyond mere recitation of the rule. It needs to involve scenario-based exercises and critical thinking drills that help officers understand how to apply this standard in dynamic, real-world situations. Officers must be trained to consider the entirety of an encounter, recognizing how their own actions and decisions, as well as those of the suspect, contribute to the evolving context from the initial contact through any use of force. Furthermore, the decision serves as a strong directive for law enforcement agencies nationwide to undertake a thorough review and, where necessary, update their existing use of force policies. These departmental policies must be in clear alignment with the Supreme Court's guidance in ensuring they explicitly incorporate the totality of the circumstances standard rather than narrower, now rejected interpretations. Agencies are also reminded that their policies must reflect not only federal constitutional law as interpreted by the Supreme Court, but also relevant state statutes and state-level case law, creating a comprehensive framework for officer conduct and accountability. This proactive review is essential for legal compliance and for building public trust. Looking ahead, the ruling is set to significantly influence how future use of force cases are litigated and adjudicated. By setting a clear precedent that mandates the application of the totality of the circumstances standard, the Supreme Court aims to foster greater uniformity and thoroughness in judicial evaluations of police conduct across all federal circuits. This should lead to more consistent outcomes and a more predictable legal landscape for both plaintiffs and defendants. It is important to note, however, that the Supreme Court did not address the specific issue of officer-created jeopardy in this case, as it was not presented in the lower courts, leaving this complex aspect of use of force analysis for potential clarification in future legal challenges. In conclusion, the Supreme Court's unanimous decision delivered on May 15, 2025, marks a critical juncture in the ongoing effort to refine the legal standards governing police use of force. By decisively rejecting the restrictive moment of threat rule and reaffirming the totality of the circumstances standard, the court has emphasized the need for a comprehensive, context-sensitive approach to evaluating these incidents. This ruling will inevitably reshape law enforcement training curricula, prompt revisions to departmental policies, and guide judicial reasoning in future cases. Ultimately, the decision strives to achieve a more equitable balance, acknowledging the challenging realities of policing while robustly safeguarding the constitutional rights of all individuals and promoting greater accountability within law enforcement.